So everybody knows at this point that Trump is going to run for president in 2024. What everybody is assuming and kind of expecting is for Ron DeSantis to also run for president in 2024. And because of his growing popularity, what the left is trying to do is vilify him in advance. So if he does win the Republican ticket and he's put up against whoever the Democrats decide to put up, then they would have done their due diligence and already vilified him well in advance of the actual campaign taking place. And it's kind of similar. What's happening to DeSantis is kind of similar to what happened to Trump in that he was kind of a celebrity and everybody loved him until he got into the realm of politics. As soon as Trump dipped his hand into the pool of politics, he immediately became the villain. He immediately became the enemy because it was apparent from the very beginning that he wasn't going to put up with this left-wing bullcrap. And it's similar in the case of DeSantis in that as the potential for him running for president has become more and more of a reality, and we also know that he is not going to put up with the left-wing nonsense, he has become more and more of a villain in the eyes of the leftists and in the eyes of liberals everywhere. So they are trying to vilify him in advance. There is a article in Vanity Fair, which has been circulating around Twitter that I saw, and the title of this article is, quote, "A comprehensive guide to why a Ron DeSantis presidency would be as terrifying as a Trump one. His bigoted policies and authoritarian behavior make him just as bad a pick for the top job in Washington." So I think it's very unfair for people to lump Ron DeSantis into the same kind of political category as Trump, especially when, if you understand how left-wing people view Trump, that he is an authoritarian dictator who tried to start a insurrection and failed. That's how the left views Trump. And to lump DeSantis into that same kind of category automatically, it's disingenuous and it's unfair. And in terms of how DeSantis handles himself, he is far more classy and far more disciplined than Trump, and he's a lot easier on the ears. Now, I actually think that when you mix the way you handle the media or the way DeSantis handles the media in terms of getting things done, he's actually better than Trump. He can get things done, but also he's not quite as controversial when it comes to how he handles the media. And he's not a battering ram. He's a lot more graceful. He has a lot more political grace than Trump does. So I don't think that he belongs in the same kind of political category as Trump at all. And this article is kind of lengthy, so I'm going to point out some of the major bullet points and push back on them a little bit. And I'm not going to read the entire thing word for word, but I just want to make note of the bullet points here. So the first one we come across is the reason why a Ron DeSantis presidency could be very scary is because, one, he thinks it's okay to treat human beings like chattel. Remember when the state of Florida sent a bunch of planes to Texas, lured Venezuelan migrants onto said planes with the promise of housing, jobs, and basic services, told them they were headed for Boston, and then dumped them on the tiny island of Martha's Vineyard? So first of all, I think it's important to point out the kind of language that they are using by saying migrants. They're trying to mislead you. They say, well, they're migrants. No, let's be completely honest here about what we are talking about. We are talking about illegal immigrants. We are talking about people who entered in this country illegally. They tried to get into the U.S. illegally, and they succeeded. Honestly, they're lucky that they got sent to Martha's Vineyard, because in different administrations, they probably just would have been shipped back to exactly where they came from. And I think it's kind of hypocritical for people to harshly criticize right-wing leaders for how they handle illegal immigration when you have the Biden administration completely and utterly failing at every turn when it comes to how they handle the border. The reason why right-wing leaders are having to deal with illegal immigration right now is because the Biden administration and the Democrats have completely failed in every aspect of dealing with the problem themselves. So to criticize people like Ron DeSantis for how they handle it, and then turn around and not criticize Joe Biden at all for how his administration handles it, I think is kind of hypocritical. And DeSantis does not deserve that kind of pushback and blowback. He is dangerously anti-science. After 3 weeks of taking the COVID-19 pandemic seriously by declaring it a public health emergency and ordering a statewide lockdown, DeSantis apparently decided science was for suckers. We will never do any of these lockdowns again, he said in April 2020, as thousands of Americans were dying each day, lifting all restrictions on schools, businesses, and government buildings, and banning local governments from enforcing their own public health measures like mask mandates. So, one thing I will give DeSantis credit for in terms of how he handled COVID, he seemed like he was one of the only people that actually took into consideration the after effects of lockdowns. Because what nobody wants to talk about is the quality of life that people have after lockdown, the amount of small businesses that have been destroyed, depression rates, suicide rates, all of these long-term effects that we are going through right now because of how harsh some places lock down. And you can look at it from a state-by-state, you can look at it on a state-by-state basis, but Ron DeSantis was kind of the leader in saying, look, we're not going to sacrifice our entire economy by shutting down everything. We're not going to sacrifice the education of our young people by kicking them out of schools and making them learn from home, especially when it's the young children who are least likely to die from COVID. We're not going to do that for them. We're not going to do that to them. We're not going to set them back in that kind of way. And look, I didn't want anybody to die. I don't want anybody to die from COVID, but you also have to ask the question, what kind of long-term negative effects are we going to suffer through because we lock down everything? And I understand when you look at places like California, which has a much larger population, so it's more likely that more people are going to die of COVID, but they ended up having more deaths. They were obsessed with COVID. They were obsessed with lockdowns and restrictions and vaccines and mask mandates. They were obsessed with all of it. And looking back, especially with the mask mandates, it's like the masks didn't really do what we thought they were going to do unless you had super high quality medical masks. And then the vaccines didn't even do what they said they were going to do. So it's a different take on how to handle COVID. I don't think Ron DeSantis handled it wrong. Obviously, people die, but it's sad that people lost their lives due to COVID, but you also have to take into consideration how lockdowns are going to affect people long term. And Ron DeSantis seemed like one of the only people who are willing to have that conversation. So for that, I give him credit. After initially telling people to get vaccinated against the virus, he reversed course, refusing to say if he'd gotten a booster shot. I don't owe you an explanation as to why or why not I got vaccinated. And I certainly do not have to carry around papers and let you know whenever I get a booster shot or a COVID-19 vaccine. And Ron DeSantis doesn't have to either. If he's to a point where he got a booster shot, then he's already fully vaccinated. Okay, so he doesn't have to carry around a neon sign that says, hey, I got vaccinated 4 times and I got 37 booster shots. He doesn't owe you that kind of information. So it's just nonsense. He does not owe you that. I don't owe you that. Nobody owes you that. It's personal health information. And so just because he won't reveal, he's already fully vaccinated. So for you to try and vilify him for not saying whether or not he got a booster shot is kind of ridiculous. We go on down to the next bullet point here. He wants to make it harder for people to vote and had Floridians arrested as part of another one of his political stunts. Like many a Republican, DeSantis is a big proponent of disenfranchising voters and has signed a raft of laws making it harder for people to cast ballots for their candidates of choice, including ones limiting the use of drop boxes, hampering Floridians' ability to vote by mail, and preventing the distribution of food or water to voters waiting in long lines. As for the mail-in voting, I think it is far more effective for people to actually go out and physically vote. I think it's a lot more efficient. And you could tell over the last election that we just had, Florida had the results like that. Like by the end of the night, you already had a pretty good idea of who won. All the ballots were in. Very efficient, very efficient. And so by extending the amount of mail-in voting and casting ballots, drop boxes, all these different things, it does make things a little bit harder. I'm not saying that mail-in voting overall is bad in every single scenario, because I'm not saying it's bad in every single scenario, but it is certainly more effective the way Florida has done things, because like I said, they had the results like that. And then in terms of not distributing food or water in voting lines, I got up like at 5 a.m. During the 2016 election, I got up like at 5 a.m. and stood in line for probably about an hour to go vote. And it was cold outside. The line was out the door. I was standing outside. It was cold. Nobody was offering me hot chocolate. Nobody was offering me a candy bar. Okay, so for you to try and vilify Ron DeSantis over something like that is stupid. During a press conference he held in August to brag about his work cracking down instances of supposed wrongdoing, the governor told reporters that more than a dozen people had been arrested on charges of voting illegally in the 2020 election, and warned this is the opening salvo. As it turned out, the number was 19. The majority of people were black and thought they were legally allowed to vote. I don't know what the whole story is behind these 19 people getting arrested, but it's trying to say this. It's just 19 people. Okay, we're not talking about 119,000 people. We're not talking about 19,000 people. This is just 19 people. Okay, of all of Florida, out of all the people that live in Florida, only 19 were arrested because people thought they were voting illegally. And they say the majority were black. Okay, are we talking about, out of the 19 people that were arrested, are we talking 18? Are we talking 10? Or, how many are we talking here? So obviously it wasn't just black people that were arrested out of the 19. I think it's dumb and disingenuous to try to paint DeSantis as somebody who wants to disenfranchise voters, particularly minority voters. I don't think that's true. I don't think saying that 19 people out of all the people in Florida were arrested for potentially illegally voting, I don't think 19 people arrested is enough evidence to say that he is racist when it comes to voters, and he's in favor of voter suppression, and he's gunning for minorities to keep them from voting. I don't see that. So he's anti-free speech, particularly the kind of free speech that says the United States hasn't always been great for non-white people. Republicans absolutely love to talk about their love of free speech and the First Amendment, but you have to do too much chipping away at that claim to realize what they actually want is for people to only be free to say the kinds of things they approve of. Few things embody this contradiction better than DeSantis' ridiculously named Stop Woke Act, which he signed into law in April, and which restricts conversations about race in schools and businesses, that allows students and workers to sue if they believe a classroom lesson or workplace training course caused them to feel guilt, anguish, or any form of psychological distress due to their race. Now, I think that this article is being vague on purpose, because it says, which restricts conversations about race in schools and businesses. So they make it sound like that any mention of racial issues, history in schools, whatever it is automatically vetoed, and then you can't talk about that stuff at all. What DeSantis was putting his finger on was this critical race theory nonsense that essentially was trying to indoctrinate kids into believing that because you are white, automatically means that you are bad. And it's not necessarily about teaching history, which is useful and necessary, the good, the bad, and everything. It's that they're trying to indoctrinate their kids into immediately making them feel guilty for their skin color. And that's really what DeSantis was trying to stop. That's what he was trying to prohibit. He was essentially saying that this doesn't need to take place in our schools. Okay? And it doesn't need to take place in our workplaces either. This whole idea where you have to separate, we're going to have black people meet over here and white people meet over here. Here's all the trigger warnings. Here's what you need to do to realize that, you're racist, or here's what you need to do to not be racist, and all of this training. Okay, that's what he's talking about. He's not talking about general discussions about American history and the racial issues therein. He's talking about this guilt, this idea that of white guilt. It doesn't need to be taught in our schools. You don't need to segregate your workplace based on minorities and white people. You don't need to do all of that stuff. All of that stuff is nonsense and very damaging. That is what he is talking about. He's waging war on trans people. In November, at the reported urging of DeSantis, the Florida Board of Medicine and the State Board of Osteopathic Medicine voted to prohibit trans minors in Florida from receiving gender-affirming medical care, despite doctors and mental health experts saying it is safe and beneficial for the people who need it. Okay. So we're getting to the territory where it's not that we're getting into territory. They're trying to vilify Ron DeSantis by making it seem like he's just a horrible person. Like everything Ron DeSantis has done is horrible. But when you dig deeper into it, what you realize is that they hate Ron DeSantis simply because he won't let leftist people do whatever they want. Okay, and I don't think that it is a bad thing for Ron DeSantis to veto the idea that young children should mutilate themselves in order to become transgender and pursue gender affirming surgery. It's ridiculous. The fact that Ron DeSantis doesn't want the children of Florida to be misled and to be permanently damaged by this LGBTQ nonsense, to me, does not seem like a cause that is worthy of vilifying him over. Before that, his administration eliminated Medicaid coverage for transgender care for poor people of any age, and also barred transgender girls from competing in sports. Ron DeSantis is not a villain for saving women's sports. And these are extremely woke. It's not that Ron DeSantis is doing evil things. It's that he refuses to bow down to the most extreme woke ideas. Men and boys taking over women's sports because they transitioned. That's an extreme idea. And it's an extreme position to hold that you think that is fair. And Ron DeSantis is simply saying, we're not going to destroy women's sports by catering to a handful of young men who think that they are girls. We're not going to do that. We're not going to destroy their chances of getting tuitions paid for and scholarships. We're not going to destroy their chances to compete. We're not going to do any of that. That is not evil. That is not bad. That doesn't make you a villain. It simply makes you somebody with common sense. And when you're on the left, when you're that far left and you're that extreme on the left, common sense kind of flies out the window. So I don't think that that's wrong of Ron DeSantis at all. Don't say gay. It's hard to think of a more terrifying thing that has come out of Florida in recent years than the dystopian anti-LGBTQ plus legislation formerly known as the Parental Rights in Education Act, dubbed the Don't Say Gay Bill by its critics. The legislation was signed into law by DeSantis in March 2022 and prohibits teachers from discussing any gender identity and sexual orientation in kindergarten through third grade. It also prohibits discussing such topics in, quote, a manner that is not age appropriate for development or developmentally appropriate through 12th grade. Now you see how extreme these people really are. That they hate it that teachers cannot sexually influence your very young children. Okay, he's simply saying that if you are a teacher and you are responsible for the education of young, impressionable children, You do not get to indoctrinate them with your sexual and gender ideology outside of the normal standards of teaching. Okay? And I would feel uncomfortable if my children were being over-sexualized in school. Okay? I would want to know that. I would feel like I would need to know that. And particularly when you get into this realm of boys can be girls and girls can be boys, and we're going to talk about the millions of different genders that now exist. It is influencing children in such a negative way, and using their sexuality and using your beliefs of sexual orientation to confuse them. That's what he's talking about. He's not saying that you don't get to teach biology in high school. That's not what he is saying. He's saying you do not get to explicitly explain very lewd and inappropriate things to young people in schools beyond what they're capable of understanding, because it's not your place. They're doing it in such a way that is influencing them and trying to draw them into the LGBTQ grasp. It's not just explaining biology. They're trying to confuse kids about their gender. They're trying to confuse kids about their sexuality. And it's young kids that don't even need to know about all of this stuff that they're trying to indoctrinate. And DeSantis simply says, no, I don't blame him for that either. He's a massive bully. He's anti-abortion. Okay, this is another one I wanted to get to. Prior to the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, DeSantis signed a law banning abortions beginning at 15 weeks of pregnancy with no exceptions for rape or incest. Now, me personally, I think that there does need to be some extended writing in terms of situations where rape has occurred or incest has occurred. I feel like that does need to be explained out. That's not something that you should just leave out. So that is something that I think that Florida needs to do a little bit better on. Maybe Ron DeSantis needs to do a little bit better on. But I will say they do allow 15 weeks is what? Okay, 4, 8, 12, 16. It's almost 4 months. Okay, so in instances where rape or incest has occurred, they still do have that 4-month period of having an abortion. Now, again, that I still think that there needs to be writing to explain the situations for rape or incest, but they still have access to abortion up to 15 weeks. So that's the caveat with the rape and incest part of it. In terms of just the abortion part of it, where the majority of abortions that take place are simply because of convenience, I don't think that that's a bad thing. Okay, preserving the lives of the next generation, ultimately, I don't see how you can be vilified for something like that. I think that's overall a win. Roe v. Wade Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade as a whole is a good thing. He supported Trump until it was no longer politically expedient to do so. So, in terms of supporting Trump and backing Trump, Trump has kind of dug his own hole where he has now essentially ostracized himself from the rest of the Republican Party, and he continues to do things and say things that pushes potential friends and people who are willing, it pushes people who are wanting to buy in away. And that's what Trump has done. So to say that, wouldn't you be more concerned if DeSantis has gotten closer and closer to Trump and backed Trump more and more the crazier Trump has got? Okay, there comes a certain point very early on in Trump's presidency, like things were good. Before COVID happened, things were relatively okay. Before all of BLM and before all of COVID and how those things were handled, everything was relatively okay. But there does come a point where Trump has essentially pushed everyone away and singled himself out, and now he's kind of this lone wolf who's running as a Republican. I think that DeSantis pulling away from Trump. If he's going to run against Trump, then he has to be able to pull away to a certain extent. Like, if you're concerned that a Ron DeSantis presidency is going to be as destructive as a Trump presidency, then you should be grateful that he is pulling away from what Trump is doing, as opposed to growing close, as opposed to just getting closer and closer to Trump as time goes on. And I think at some point you are allowed to step away and say, hey, this isn't profiting me anything. This isn't profiting my campaign anything. And Trump, in some ways, is very destructive and self-destructive, and he just likes to kick everyone. And at some point, it doesn't profit you anything to stay within his reach and stay within his grasp. So I don't think that calling DeSantis out for stepping away from Trump is necessarily a bad thing, especially at this point if he's going to start running against him in the next couple years. He's made it harder for protesters to speak out about injustice and easier for anti-justice people to hit protesters with their cars. In April 2021, DeSantis signed an anti-riot bill into law that, among other things, grants civil immunity to people who decide to drive their cars into protesters who are blocking a road. We've all seen the videos of the like climate activists and the animal rights activists who sit in the middle of the road, and this is usually in town, usually happens in town. They're sitting in the middle of the road, they're holding signs and all this garbage. There aren't a lot of videos of those people simply getting plowed over. Okay, it's not like you have a wide group of people, a huge group of people who just gun it as soon as they see an activist sitting in the middle of the road and just plow right into them. That's not happening. What he is talking about here, don't take this out of context. This whole anti-riot bill, this is when you look at the pictures of BLM and the buildings are on fire, the cars are on fire, you have people, just a horde of people surrounding cars and trying to break into vehicles. Okay, if there's a group and a horde of people, of rioters, people looking to do damage surrounding your car, they're beating on your windows and breaking your windows, then yeah, you have the ability and the right to drive away to protect yourself and your family. Okay, you don't just have to sit there and take a crowbar to the face because, oh well, they're peaceful, quote unquote, peacefully protesting. Okay, that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about running over an animal rights activist with a semi because they were sitting at a stoplight. It's not what we're talking about. The legislation, which was drafted in the wake of the 2020s, 2020's Black Lives Matter protests, also penalizes local governments that interfere with efforts to stop riots. So this is in cases of, hold on, let me look at the rest of this. Penalizes local governments. It also penalizes local governments that interfere with efforts to stop riots. This is in terms of where you have specific maybe cities, and you see this happen where essentially the police don't get involved. They just let them do whatever they want. BLM, they have complete rule over the streets. They're opening up Chaz and Chop. They're seceding from the United States and opening up their little villages and all these different things. This is simply saying that if you're a small town and you're like, well, we're just gonna let them do whatever they want, and we're just gonna let them secede from the United States, and we're just gonna let them take over that. You can't do that. Okay, at some point, the governor or the government of that state is going to be able to step in and take back control. And because what you have to realize is you might look at it like, well, what about the people's right to protest? Okay, well, what about everybody else's right to be safe? Okay, what about everybody else's right to drive to work and go to their business, which may or may not be on fire? Okay, that's the thing you have to consider. You have to consider that there are law-abiding citizens who are ready to get back to their normal life, and you can't just have towns and major parts of cities shut down because people are rioting to the point where it's not safe for other people to be in that area. He has no interest in preventing gun violence. I read an article by CBS from last year, and they were going over the gun-related deaths by state and ranking it by state for gun deaths per 100,000 people. And Florida was sitting at 29th with 13.7 gun deaths per 100,000 people. In terms of gun violence and gun-related deaths, Florida is doing better than most of the other states in this country. So this idea that Ron DeSantis doesn't care about preventing gun violence, he's obviously doing something right. He's obviously doing something better than the other leaders in other states are doing. He's doing better than a lot of other states. So let's not take this out of context. So all of this, like I said, in pointing out some of these bullet points, a lot of it, it's kind of misleading, and you need to know what DeSantis is really against. It's not that he's against talking about the racial issues of this country or discussing racial issues throughout history in schools. That's not what he's against. He's against teaching this critical race theory, which basically guilts white children to the point where they're coming home full of shame and asking their parents why they're racist. That's what he's against. Context matters. They're trying to vilify him ahead of time. Don't take these things out of context. Do some real digging for yourself, because going back to what I was saying at the very beginning, in terms of getting things done and handling the media and putting up with all this nonsense, DeSantis does a phenomenal job. And to lump him into the same kind of political category as Trump is disingenuous and unfair. And at this point, he might be the best pick for Republicans moving forward.